December 7, 1942. Exactly 1 year after Pearl Harbor. In a cramped intelligence bunker beneath Tokyo, a Japanese cryptanalyst named Commander Takeo Yoshikawa stares at a stack of intercepted American radio transmissions. His team has already broken the diplomatic codes of 3 nations. They've deciphered British naval communications. They've cracked Chinese military ciphers. But these latest American messages, captured from Marine units in the Pacific, remain utterly incomprehensible. The phonetic patterns don't match any known language. The syntax follows no recognizable structure. Some words repeat, but their meanings shift impossibly from one context to another. Yoshikawa's best analysts have spent weeks applying every technique in their arsenal. Frequency analysis reveals nothing. Pattern recognition yields only chaos. One frustrated cryptographer will later write in his diary that listening to these transmissions felt like, quote, hearing demons speak. What Yoshikawa couldn't have known, what no Japanese intelligence officer would discover throughout the entire war, was that he wasn't listening to a code at all. He was listening to a language spoken by fewer than 30,000 people on Earth. A language with no written alphabet, no grammar books, no dictionaries that outsiders could access. A language that had evolved in isolation for over 1,000 years in the high deserts and canyonlands of what would become the American Southwest. The language was Navajo, and the men speaking it were about to change the course of the Pacific War. This is the story of the Navajo Code Talkers, a group of young Native Americans who created the only unbroken code in modern military history. But it's also the story of why they succeeded where mechanical encryption machines failed. Why a language could accomplish what mathematics could not. And why the most sophisticated code-breaking apparatus ever assembled by Imperial Japan never decoded a single message. To understand their achievement, we must first understand the crisis that made them necessary. By late 1942, American forces in the Pacific faced a dire problem that threatened every operation they mounted. Japanese intelligence was winning the hidden war for information, and Americans were dying because of it. The war in the Pacific was fundamentally different from the European theater. In Europe, armies moved across landscapes measured in miles. In the Pacific, they moved across oceans measured in thousands of miles. Every operation required precise coordination between naval vessels, aircraft, and amphibious assault forces spread across vast distances. And every bit of that coordination depended on radio communication. Radio was both salvation and curse. It allowed commanders to coordinate complex operations in real time. But it also broadcast every order, every position, every plan directly to enemy listening posts. By early 1942, the Japanese had constructed an extensive network of intercept stations stretching from Tokyo to Rabaul. Hundreds of trained operators monitored American frequencies 24 hours a day. What they heard, they recorded. What they recorded, they sent to cryptanalysts. The American military's standard encryption systems were being systematically compromised. The Sagaba cipher machine, supposedly unbreakable, had been partially penetrated. Simpler field codes used by Marine units were being read almost in real time. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces had demonstrated uncanny knowledge of American positions and intentions. At the Battle of Savo Island, they'd ambushed an Allied naval force with devastating precision, suggesting they'd intercepted and decoded operational orders. The human cost was mounting. Every decoded message potentially meant another ambush, another failed operation, another transport ship sunk before it could deliver reinforcements. Marine commanders in the field began to distrust their own communications systems. Some resorted to sending runners with handwritten messages, a practice that worked for short distances but became impossible during fluid combat operations spanning dozens of miles. Into this crisis stepped a civilian engineer named Philip Johnston. He wasn't a linguist or a cryptographer. He was a World War I veteran and the son of Protestant missionaries who had spent his childhood on the Navajo reservation. He'd grown up speaking Navajo fluently, and he understood something that military planners didn't. The language was virtually unknown outside the Navajo Nation. No Japanese university taught it. No Western dictionary adequately documented it. No grammar existed in any library that an enemy cryptanalyst could access. In February 1942, Johnston drove to Camp Elliott near San Diego and requested a meeting with Lieutenant Colonel James Jones, the area signal officer. What he proposed sounded almost absurd: recruit Native Americans to transmit military messages in their native language. No codes. No ciphers. Just Navajo spoken directly over the radio. Jones was skeptical. The military had tried using Native American languages in World War I, Choctaw, Comanche, Cherokee, with mixed results. The problem was that military terminology didn't exist in these languages. How do you say tank in Navajo? How do you say amphibious assault, or coordinates, or dive bomber? Without precise military vocabulary, the whole system would break down. Johnston had an answer. The Navajo would create new terms, militarized Navajo words that could convey complex modern concepts using the ancient language's existing vocabulary and structure. It would be a code within a language that already functioned as a code. Jones remained unconvinced until Johnston arranged a demonstration. He brought 4 Navajo men to Camp Elliott and staged a test. Jones gave them a typical military message, the kind that would take 3 hours to encode, transmit, and decode using standard methods. The Navajo men translated it, transmitted it in their language, and translated it back. Total time, 20 seconds. Jones immediately authorized a pilot program. In May 1942, 29 young Navajo men arrived at Camp Pendleton. They ranged in age from 18 to 35. Some had never left the reservation before. Many spoke limited English. Most had never seen the ocean. They were about to become the first class of the Marine Corps' most unusual unit, and they were about to do something no group of soldiers had ever done before. They were going to invent a military code from scratch. The first challenge these 29 men faced wasn't tactical or technical. It was conceptual. They had to bridge 2 entirely different worldviews: the ancient, cyclical, nature-focused perspective embedded in the Navajo language, and the linear, technological, mechanized reality of modern warfare. The Navajo language had words for eagle, lightning, and sacred mountains. It had no words for submarine, grenade launcher, or battalion. But the language's structure offered unexpected advantages. Navajo is what linguists call a tone language, with an agglutinative grammar. A single word can contain an entire sentence's worth of meaning, with prefixes and suffixes modifying the root in ways that convey tense, aspect, mood, and subject in compact form. More importantly, Navajo speakers don't think in the subject-verb-object structure that dominates European languages. They think in terms of motion, duration, and relationship. The 29 recruits worked 12 to 15 hours a day creating their code. They started with an alphabet. Since Navajo had no alphabet of its own, they assigned Navajo words to English letters. But here they innovated in a crucial way. They created multiple words for common letters. The letter E, which appears frequently in English, could be represented by 3 different Navajo words: days, elk, aja, ear, or ana, eye. This destroyed the frequency patterns that codebreakers relied on. Even if Japanese cryptanalysts somehow identified these words, they couldn't determine what letter they represented through statistical analysis. Next came military vocabulary. This is where their creativity became remarkable. They couldn't simply invent random words. The terms had to be memorable to all Navajo speakers and had to follow the language's natural logic. So they used metaphor and analogy, drawing on the natural world they knew intimately. Aircraft became birds. A bomber, something that flies and drops destruction, became jay-sho or buzzard. A fighter plane became dehi-tai-hai or hummingbird. A dive bomber became genie or chicken hawk. Ships became fish. A battleship, the largest vessel, became lotso or whale. A destroyer became sielo or shark. A submarine became beshlo or iron fish. The metaphors carried their own logic. Once you understood the system, the terms made intuitive sense. But to outsiders, especially to cryptanalysts expecting military terminology, the conversations sounded surreal. References to turtles and eagles, to crawfish and otters, dominated discussions of naval operations. It was a code that arose naturally from the language's own structure, rather than being artificially imposed upon it. By September 1942, the original 29 had developed a working code with over 200 terms. They'd memorized the entire system. Nothing was written down. Each man could encode, transmit, receive, and decode messages at speeds that astonished their Marine officers. They were ready for combat. Guadalcanal was their proving ground. When the first Code Talkers went ashore in November 1942, most Marine officers didn't know what to make of them. These men didn't fit any standard category. They weren't interpreters. They weren't translating between English speakers. They weren't cipher clerks. They weren't using machines or code books. They were something entirely new. The first time a Code Talker transmitted a message during combat, the results were immediate and dramatic. A forward observer spotted Japanese artillery positions and needed to call in naval fire support. Under the old system, this would require encoding the coordinates, transmitting the cipher, and waiting for the ship to decode and respond, a process taking 30 minutes or more. The Code Talker transmitted in Navajo. The ship's Code Talker received and decoded. Naval guns opened fire 4 minutes later. That speed became crucial during the chaos of amphibious assaults. At Tarawa, at Saipan, at Iwo Jima, operations where every minute meant lives saved or lost, the Code Talkers provided a communication link that couldn't be jammed, couldn't be decoded, and couldn't be delayed by cumbersome encryption procedures. During the first 48 hours at Iwo Jima, 6 Code Talkers transmitted and received over 800 messages without a single error. But their effectiveness created its own dangers. On multiple occasions, American soldiers who'd never seen Code Talkers before mistook them for Japanese soldiers. The physical appearance, the incomprehensible language, the proximity to radio equipment, it all seemed suspicious. Several Code Talkers reported being detained at gunpoint by Marines from other units who assumed they were enemy infiltrators. This problem became so serious that Code Talkers were eventually assigned bodyguards, Marines whose job was not just to protect them from enemy fire, but to verify their identity to American troops. Private First Class Carl Gorman later recalled an incident on Saipan where a Marine officer, hearing him speak Navajo over the radio, pulled his sidearm and accused Gorman of being a Japanese spy. Only the intervention of his bodyguard prevented tragedy. Meanwhile, Japanese intelligence was becoming increasingly frustrated. By mid-1943, they'd identified that American Marine units were using some kind of unbreakable communication system. They'd captured radio equipment. They'd interrogated prisoners who'd overheard Code Talker transmissions. They'd recorded hundreds of hours of these mysterious broadcasts. Nothing helped. Japanese cryptanalysts tried every technique they knew. They attempted frequency analysis, assuming it was a substitution cipher. They looked for pattern repetition, thinking it might be a polyalphabetic system. They searched for grammatical structures that might reveal an underlying European language. Every approach failed. The language, because that's what it was, refused to yield its secrets. In December 1943, Japanese forces on Bougainville captured a Navajo Marine, not a code talker, but a soldier who spoke the language. Their interrogators tried to make him decode intercepted transmissions. He couldn't. Even to a native Navajo speaker, the code talker's militarized vocabulary was incomprehensible without training. The metaphorical terms, the invented words, the specialized terminology, none of it matched the civilian Navajo language. The captured Marine could recognize that the transmissions were in Navajo, but he couldn't translate the military content. This incident revealed the code's deepest layer of security. It wasn't just a Native American language unknown to Japanese cryptanalysts. It was a specialized dialect of that language, created specifically for military use, known only to the trained code talkers. Even finding a Navajo speaker wouldn't help the enemy decode messages. They would need to find a code talker and convince him to betray his brothers and his country. None ever did. By 1945, over 400 Navajo Marines had been trained as code talkers. They served in every major Marine engagement in the Pacific: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Paliliu, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. They transmitted thousands of messages, from routine status reports to urgent tactical commands during the most intense combat of the war. Not one of those messages was decoded by enemy intelligence. The strategic impact is difficult to overstate. In previous conflicts, commanders had to assume that enemy intelligence would eventually decode some percentage of their communications. This assumption forced them to use circumspect language, to avoid transmitting sensitive information over radio, and to change codes frequently, creating delays and confusion. The Navajo Code removed that constraint entirely. For the first time in modern warfare, American forces could coordinate complex operations in real time without fear of cryptographic compromise. Artillery officers could transmit exact coordinates without encoding delays. Infantry commanders could request immediate air support without worrying about ambushes based on decoded messages. Naval task forces could communicate freely without complex cipher procedures. Major Howard Connor, a signal officer at Iwo Jima, later stated flatly, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." This wasn't hyperbole. The 5-week battle for that 8-square-mile island required unprecedented coordination between ground forces, naval artillery, and close air support. Code talkers working in pairs operated 24 hours a day, maintaining the communication links that made that coordination possible. The casualty rates among code talkers reflected their frontline role. They were radio operators, which meant they carried bulky equipment and often worked near command posts, priority targets for enemy artillery and snipers. 13 code talkers died in combat. Dozens more were wounded. They shared every danger faced by other Marines, with the added burden of knowing that capture would mean interrogation specifically focused on extracting their code. But they also experienced a unique form of psychological pressure. Many code talkers reported struggling with the dual nature of their service. They were fighting for a country that had, within living memory, waged war against their ancestors. They wore the uniform of a government that had forcibly relocated Navajo children to boarding schools designed to erase native culture and language, the very language they were now using to defend that same government. Private First Class Samuel Billison spoke about this paradox years later. He described leaving the reservation in 1943, where unemployment exceeded 90% and most Navajo families lived without electricity or running water, to fight for a democracy that did not recognize Native Americans as full citizens. Navajos could not vote in Arizona or New Mexico. They were subject to Bureau of Indian Affairs oversight that limited their sovereignty. Yet they volunteered at rates higher than almost any other demographic group. The code itself continued to evolve throughout the war. As military technology advanced and new equipment entered service, the code talkers added new terms. By 1945, their vocabulary included over 600 words. They developed terms for everything from radar to napalm, from amphibious tractors to proximity fuses. Each new word followed the original metaphorical logic, maintaining the system's internal consistency. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Code Talkers simply packed their equipment and went home. No public recognition. No ceremony. Most returned to the reservation to find the same poverty and discrimination they'd left. For nearly 25 years, they couldn't even talk about what they'd done. The code remained classified until 1968, maintained as a strategic reserve in case it was needed in future conflicts. Japanese military records captured after the war confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. Despite enormous effort, despite sophisticated cryptanalytic techniques, despite the capture of a Navajo prisoner, Japanese intelligence never broke the code. In their internal documents, frustrated cryptanalysts variously described the Navajo transmissions as indecipherable, irregular, and, in one memorable instance, the language of demons. The Navajo Code represents a unique case in the history of military cryptography. Every other major code or cipher system of World War II was eventually broken. Some during the war, others in the decades since. The German Enigma machine, considered unbreakable by its users, was systematically decoded by Allied cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park. The Japanese Purple cipher machine was penetrated by American codebreakers before Pearl Harbor. Soviet cipher systems were partially compromised. British naval codes were read by German intelligence. Only the Navajo Code remained secure. This wasn't due to technological superiority or mathematical complexity. It was due to something simpler and more profound: linguistic isolation. The code worked because it was based on a language that existed outside the awareness of enemy cryptanalysts. No amount of mathematical skill, no application of statistical analysis, no computing power. Nothing could break a code when the codebreakers didn't even recognize what they were hearing. This success contained a bitter irony. The United States government had spent decades attempting to eradicate Native American languages. Beginning in the 1870s, federal policy aimed at forced assimilation required Native children to attend boarding schools where they were punished, sometimes violently, for speaking their native languages. The explicit goal was cultural erasure. Kill the Indian, save the man, as one school superintendent infamously phrased it. Many of the Code Talkers had themselves attended these schools. They'd been beaten for speaking Navajo. They'd been forced to abandon traditional dress, customs, and beliefs. Then, when war came, the same government that had tried to destroy their language recruited them specifically to use that language in combat. It was a jarring reversal, and not all Code Talkers accepted it without ambivalence. Yet the code's success ultimately helped shift American attitudes toward native languages and cultures. After the war, as the Code Talkers' story gradually became public, it provided concrete evidence that Native American cultures had practical value, that indigenous knowledge systems weren't primitive obstacles to progress but sophisticated tools with unique capabilities. This realization came too late for many languages already extinct or nearly so, but it contributed to changing federal policy in subsequent decades. The code also illuminated something important about the nature of security itself. The most elaborate mechanical encryption systems of World War II, machines like Enigma and Purple, which used rotors and wiring to create mathematically complex ciphers, were all eventually broken. The Navajo Code, which used no machines and relied entirely on human knowledge, never was. This suggests that security sometimes emerges not from complexity but from uniqueness, not from mathematical sophistication but from cultural specificity. Modern cryptography has largely moved away from the linguistic approach. Computer encryption relies on mathematical algorithms and computational complexity rather than language barriers. But military forces worldwide have continued to recognize the value of linguistic security. During the Gulf War, the United States employed Comanche Code Talkers. In recent conflicts, Both American and Allied forces have used speakers of rare languages for secure tactical communications. The story of the Code Talkers was suppressed for a generation. Security classification prevented public discussion until 1968. Even after declassification, the story received relatively little attention for another 2 decades. Many Code Talkers died before receiving any public recognition for their service. This silence was partly strategic. The code might be needed again. But it was also symptomatic of broader American amnesia about Native American contributions to national defense. Only in the 1990s did the Code Talkers begin receiving formal recognition. In 2000, President Bill Clinton awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Code Talkers. In 2001, President George W. Bush honored them at the White House. By then, only 5 of the original 29 were still alive. They were men in their 80s and 90s, finally receiving acknowledgement for achievements accomplished 6 decades earlier. Behind the strategic success and historical significance were individual human beings facing extraordinary circumstances. Their personal stories reveal both the cost of their service and the complexity of their experience. Chester Nez was one of the original 29. Born in 1921, he'd been taken from his family at age 7 and sent to a boarding school where speaking Navajo earned punishment. He later recalled being forced to kneel on wooden boards while holding heavy books at arm's length, a common disciplinary method in these institutions. By the time he enlisted in 1942, he could barely speak Navajo. He had to relearn his own language from other recruits. Nez fought in every major Pacific campaign. At Guam, he spent 72 hours straight at his radio, transmitting coordinates for artillery strikes. He later described the surreal experience of speaking his childhood language while watching naval shells destroy enemy positions. When he finally slept, he dreamed in Navajo for the first time since childhood, dreams filled with the thunder of artillery and the static of radio transmissions. Joe Kiumia's story took a darker turn. He was captured on Bataan in 1942, before the Code Talker program was fully implemented. Japanese interrogators, discovering he was Navajo, tried to force him to decode intercepted transmissions. He couldn't. He wasn't a trained Code Talker and couldn't understand the specialized military vocabulary. His captors didn't believe him. They subjected him to repeated torture, including near drowning and beating. He survived over 3 years as a prisoner of war, maintaining that he couldn't decode what he genuinely couldn't understand. Samuel Tso enlisted at age 19. He later described his first combat transmission, calling in artillery fire on Guadalcanal, as the moment he fully understood what he was doing. He was speaking his grandmother's language to cause explosions that would kill other human beings. The connection between the gentle, ceremonial Navajo he'd learned as a child and the violent, military Navajo he now spoke created a psychological dissonance that troubled him for the rest of his life. Yet many Code Talkers also reported finding unexpected meaning in their service. They were using a language the government had tried to erase, proving its value in the most dramatic way possible. They were demonstrating Navajo sophistication and capability to fellow Marines who might never have met a Native American before. They were turning their heritage from a liability, something to hide or overcome, into an asset that saved American lives. The bonds between Code Talkers remained strong throughout their lives. They were bound not just by shared combat experience, but by shared linguistic and cultural knowledge that set them apart from other veterans. At reunions in later years, they would switch seamlessly between English and Navajo, sometimes mid-sentence, in ways that reflected their unique dual identity as American Marines and Navajo people. Many struggled with post-traumatic stress after the war. But the traditional Navajo culture provided healing ceremonies specifically designed to reintegrate warriors into peacetime society. These ceremonies, particularly the Enemy Way ceremony, helped Code Talkers process their combat experiences within a cultural framework that their non-native fellow veterans lacked. Carl Gorman became an artist after the war, creating paintings that drew on both his combat experience and traditional Navajo imagery. His work depicted code talkers as warriors in the traditional sense, men who'd risked everything to protect their people, but who'd done so using knowledge and language rather than just weapons. He once said that the code was a warrior's tool, but that speaking Navajo in combat was also a form of prayer. The last of the original 29 code talkers died in 2014. Chester Nez passed away in New Mexico, surrounded by family. He was 93 years old. He'd lived long enough to see the code declassified, to receive recognition from 2 presidents, and to watch Hollywood make films about his service. But in his final interviews, he emphasized something else, that he and his fellow code talkers had helped preserve the Navajo language. By proving its value, they'd ensured its survival. The story of the Navajo Code Talkers matters for reasons that extend beyond military history. It reveals something essential about value and survival, about how cultures persist and how they prove themselves. The Navajo language survived government attempts at eradication not through resistance but through utility. When the government needed the language more than it needed to destroy it, policy changed. This truth is both encouraging and troubling. It's encouraging because it demonstrates that indigenous knowledge and languages have enduring practical value that dominant cultures eventually recognize when forced by necessity. It's troubling because it suggests that minority cultures must prove their utility to survive, that their intrinsic worth isn't sufficient protection against assimilation or erasure. The code also illuminates the nature of security in an interconnected world. Japanese cryptanalysts failed not because they lacked skill or dedication, but because they operated within assumptions that didn't account for American linguistic diversity. They assumed American military communications would use English or standard cipher systems based on European languages. They never imagined that the solution to America's security problems would come from a culture that American policy had been trying to eliminate. There's a larger lesson here about diversity as strength, not as abstract principle but as concrete tactical advantage. The United States won a crucial element of the Pacific War specifically because it was not a monoculture, because it contained peoples whose languages and knowledge systems differed dramatically from those of European Americans. That diversity, often treated as a weakness or problem to be managed, proved strategically decisive. Today, the Navajo language faces new challenges. Fewer young Navajos speak it fluently. English dominates education and media even on the reservation. The language that was once suppressed by force is now declining through benign neglect and cultural change. Efforts to preserve and revitalize Navajo continue, but they face the same challenges confronting indigenous languages worldwide. The Code Talkers' legacy provides motivation for these preservation efforts. School curricula on the Navajo Nation now teach about the Code Talkers as heroes who use their language to protect both their people and their country. Young Navajos learn that their ancestors' language was more than cultural heritage. It was a strategic weapon that helped win a world war. The paradox remains unresolved. The same language that was beaten out of Navajo children in government boarding schools was later celebrated as a critical military asset. The same people who were denied citizenship rights in their home states volunteered at extraordinary rates to defend their country. The same culture that was officially designated for elimination provided the key to unbreakable military communications. What should we take from this story? Perhaps it's simply this, that knowledge systems we don't understand shouldn't be dismissed or destroyed. That linguistic and cultural diversity isn't just worth preserving for sentimental or moral reasons. It represents genuine strategic and intellectual resources that may prove invaluable in unexpected ways. That the language spoken by a grandmother teaching her grandson in a hogan in Arizona turned out to be exactly what the United States Marine Corps needed to coordinate amphibious assaults across the Pacific. The Japanese cryptanalysts who called Navajo the language of demons were wrong. It wasn't demonic. It was simply different. Different enough, ancient enough, isolated enough that it existed outside the conceptual framework of modern cryptanalysis. They couldn't break it because they couldn't even recognize what it was. In the end, the Navajo Code Talkers proved something that military planners are still learning: that sometimes the most sophisticated solution comes from the most unexpected source. That a language with no written form could be more secure than the most complex mechanical cipher. That young men from the poorest communities in America could create something that the most educated cryptographers in Japan could never crack. They did this not despite their heritage, but because of it. And in doing so, they changed history.